Good evening. I'm Sheila Tainter, and on behalf of Storm Surge and our co-sponsor, Newburyport Livable Streets, I would like to welcome you to our second program in our Fall 2020 speaker series, Climate Change and the Benefits of Green Infrastructure. All around the world, communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change. Hotter temperatures, drought in some places, as well as more frequent heavy rains and runoff in others, more intense storms, and rising sea levels. And all around the world, planners and designers are coming up with measures to cope with these impacts. We're fortunate to have with us tonight someone who has extensive experience dealing with these issues and can introduce us to the concept of green infrastructure and how we can use proven strategies to make our community more resilient. I am so pleased to introduce you to Bob Uhlig, a landscape architect and urban designer who lives here in Newburyport. Bob Uhlig is a principal at Halverson Ty & Bond Studio, a landscape architecture, planning, and urban design practice based in Boston. He has many years of experience planning projects ranging from parks, waterfronts, and streetscapes to commercial, residential, and campus landscapes. He has led the design and project management for a variety of sophisticated multidisciplinary projects that solve site design and engineering challenges and involve the seamless integration of art, architecture, and natural systems. Bob says that his greatest satisfaction comes from working collaboratively with clients and consultants on projects involving the incorporation of art and architecture into the natural landscape ecology. In addition to his professional practice, Bob contributes his expertise to a variety of public organizations focused on design and improving the public realm. He serves as a mayoral appointment to the Revere Beach Design Review Board and Suffolk Downs Revere Design Advisory Committee, as well as on the East Boston Greenway Council Board of Directors. Bob also serves on the Landscape Architectural Advisory Board and as a periodic guest lecturer and critic for Boston Architectural College and Roger Williams University, and is a frequent speaker at industry conferences. Bob has also had an impact locally. He has served on the Newburyport Parks Commission, the Newburyport Community Preservation Committee, and is chair of the Newburyport Redevelopment Authority. After Bob's presentation, there will be a Q&A, but during the presentation, Sarah Tappan and Heather Lipp will be monitoring questions in the chat window. So please feel free to ask any questions there as they come up. If you're having technical difficulties, let them know in chat and they'll help. And now, please welcome Bob Uhlig, who will share with us what is being done in other places to deal with climate change and what we can do right here in Newburyport to confront our own climate changes.
Thank you, Sheila. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining, and I hope you find this a fun and informative way to spend your COVID-free Thursday evening. I wanted to start by dedicating this talk to a good friend and Christian mentor, Don Bade, who was a prior president of the local Parker River Clean Water Association and passed away this week. And it's ironic that we're discussing a topic, that is pretty close and near to dear to his heart and what his focus was. So, and as for me, as Sheila said, I'm going on to, I can't believe it, but I'm going on to my 35th year as a practicing landscape architect, 33 of those years having relocated here from the mid-Atlantic states and living in Newburyport and working in Boston, both of which are, adjacent to the river and adjacent to the ocean, has made me more keenly attuned to kind of patterns and changes to kind of the living and breathing environment that's around us all the time. And it's enhanced my interest and passion in climate change and how we can better follow the lead of natural systems where possible to guide solutions to the challenges we face. And I hope to show you that, these green infrastructure can have multiple benefits beyond just protection, but they can provide social benefits, economic benefits, and environmental benefits. So I'll warn you ahead of time, I'm hoping that this isn't too much of a fire hose because I got a lot of information to talk about, but I've got a lot of broad experience in a lot of areas, but a master of very few of them. So let's go for the ride here. So agenda-wise, just going to look briefly at climate change and projections. I know a lot of these we've seen and I think we get desensitized to, but I think some of them are worth repeating again to set the stage. Secondarily, we're going to look at a variety of climate-focused planning initiatives that in my experience being in Boston have really ramped up and are starting to kind of get more traction over the past 10 years. We're going to look at a couple of case studies that we've worked on, my firm has worked on, that I hope you find interesting. Then we're going to look at a couple of visionary case studies. We're going to come back in and look at kind of some opportunities to do some more modest implementations here in Newburyport, and then going to just tee up for you guys who maybe have more interest in this topic, look at some local thought leaders and opportunities associated with that. So to start with, kind of, again, reminders of what are these signs of climate change that are all around us, some of them which are subtle and some of which are more obvious. And I think the more important thing is, what are the tangible impacts that some of which we have seen, but some of which we have yet to see on how the way we live our lives, our health, and our overall well-being. So I just wanted to show you this diagram, which I find is kind of interesting and compelling at the same time. So the first time you won't get it, but you see it goes from a bluer to a redder, which is showing kind of from 1880 to 2017, the trend towards a warming of temperatures across the globe. So I think that was one that people have commonly heard of. In addition, along with this temperature, it's all interrelated, such that what is expected to happen with the effects of climate change will be, because of warming temperatures and the change in the way the atmosphere is able to absorb water, there'll be an increase in precipitation intensity. And a larger portion of the rainfall will occur in shorter periods of time. I think we've seen that, here in other areas where there's more, we may have longer periods of drought, but then when we have rainfall, it's much more intense than we're historically used to it being. And you'll note here on this chart, where it's blue is areas where the climate models predict an increase in intensity by the end of the 21st century. We happen to be in one of those pretty darker blue areas, and the brown tends to be where there's going to be increased drought. One that is more common, given that we live closer to the coast, is the concepts of sea level rise. And you see there's a variety of data that are proving this out, from kind of historic records, tide gauges more in current times from the 1900s up to the present, and now satellite data is also proving that out. In the Boston area, the general projections, although they're often in flux, everybody's kind of agreed at this point that by 2030, which is now not even 10 years away, that we'll have 9 inches of sea level rise. Another 40 years down the road in 2070, we'll have another 18 inches for 27 inches of sea level rise. And by the end of the century, there's anticipated being 40 plus inches of sea level rise change. So, how do we start to think about that, and how do we deal with that? Another topic that doesn't get discussed as much is CO2 emissions and discharge. And it's interesting to see that, we are amongst the nations of China, Russia, Germany, Japan, that are highest in outputters of CO2 emissions, again, changing the atmosphere around us. And those that are highest impacted are those that are not producing it, but are those countries such as Central Africa, Asia, and kind of the South Pacific. And overall, so how do we think about these climate changes? So I like to think about this dial from the inside out. So more extreme weather, sea level rise, increased CO2, rising temperatures, all have impacts on our health, whether it be through impacts in water quality and availability of water, as we get to have a lot more issues about water rights, the availability of food supply as we get larger populations, as we have environmental degradation, the things we talked about, extreme heat, severe weather, all of which has the potential to increasingly impact our health. So how do we take measures, even if they be subtle measures? How do we walk before we run and take measures in that regard? So we're going to look a little bit at some climate change mitigation trends over time, and then turning into strategies, and then related resources. So being in Boston, I'm fortunate to be involved with an organization called Urban Lands Institute. And about 5 to 7 years ago, Urban Land Institute, as soon as sea level rise started becoming an issue with the superstorm Sandy and some of the other storms that we've seen along the East Coast, which hasn't been as severe in Boston, but have in other areas, have brought to attention some of these issues. And so Urban Land Institute, which is composed of a lot of real estate related professionals, put together with the funding of ULI a study about living with water. And so it started to think about, this not being a possibility, but being an inevitability. And so while it was a bit visionary in its thinking, it got us to think about how do we live and how do we accommodate some of these inevitable climate changes. And so while this is a bit, extreme in its notion, if we look down the road, this is a picture of Back Bay. I think it's the Berkeley Street was the idea as we have climate change. And the interesting thing about climate change is that the areas that we have filled through time are the places that the sea is most strident in its places of taking it back. That's partially because those areas of fill haven't been filled that much. But those are the areas that are most vulnerable to sea level rise. So the idea of Back Bay being a modern day Venice is something that may be, on the long distance horizon. In more recent times, the ULI then followed that study up with the idea that it's not just a water issue that we're faced with, but there's also changes, as we talked about with the change in temperature. There's an increase in heat, and particularly in urban environments. So this graphic on the right-hand side shows you, as in the Boston area on the far right around the harbor, where the city is most dense, where tree canopy is the least, where the most amount of impervious surface occurs, is where the heat island effect is going to take its biggest effect. And so what are the visionary kind of counter effects we have to that? And so that report in amongst looked at a variety of different neighborhoods around Boston and looked at the idea, in East Boston, at the idea that maybe as we move through time, we think about our transportation and maybe the need for less roads. And if we think about transforming some of our roads selectively into public open space, they can be cooling environments, they can be places of enhanced quality of life and better habitat to counteract the heat islands effect. So these were early on kind of inspirational studies that were done. More recently, that has all initiated kind of a mayor-initiated study called Climate Ready Boston that looks at overall city of Boston and where, not just the water's edges, but where is the city overall impacted by climate change. And the city has gone from an overall study to looking at a series of different neighborhood studies, one by one, and to look at the measures that need to take place in those areas to both protect and use those protections as a means of enhancing those communities. We've been fortunate to work on this area in the center, which is the South Boston neighborhood. And I'm going to zoom into that now. And so as a part of that study, the South Boston neighborhood is composed of a lot of varied neighborhoods and areas. The original historic neighborhood is the residential neighborhood you see kind of more in gray and white in the middle. And that just so happens to be on the highest area of land. The other areas of land within the dotted line are mostly the areas that we as humans have filled, which was formerly sea. And so those are the areas, as I mentioned earlier, that are most vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. And so this map identifies first with the black lines with arrows, where are those points along the shoreline that are right now, today, most vulnerable to flood pathways when we have king high tides, when we have king high tides in association with storm surges. And so the kind of darkest blue are the areas right now where they're experiencing flooding conditions in and around South Boston. As the areas get lighter, that becomes the kind of next projection. The next lightest area is kind of 2030, and then the even lighter area is 2070. One of the interesting ironies, if you know it, so this goes kind of from South Boston, Castle Island. This is Massport's Connolly Terminal, where much of the shipping containers come in and out. This is kind of maritime area, and then this is the more recently developed seaport, which ironically enough, a lot of this development was permitted prior to the last recession, so it all kind of occurred and was developed before kind of the awareness of sea level rise and climate change has come to pass. So now retroactively, these property owners are having to think about how do they protect their properties and enhance them. This is Fort Point Channel that's adjacent to South Station, and Fort Point Channel's vulnerability connects to the Massachusetts Turnpike, which is a low spot such that if the Fort Point Channel overtops, it has the ability to flood all of Back Bay, as the Mass Pike is kind of a lowered boat section where the water could make its way easily down towards Alston Brighton. So as we look at, again, a little bit more deeply at, this is Fort Point Channel at a king tide. And I'm going to show you a couple of, kind of head into some of the examples that we looked at. There's a variety of different examples of how one thinks about protection. In addition to protection, how do we create public amenity where we're also investing in infrastructure? So these slides, whether it be Chicago Riverwalk, whether it be Hudson River Park, which is more of a green solution, Oslo, Toronto waterfront, they all combine investments in infrastructure with improvements in quality of life and enhancements, in some cases, to the environment. So as we think about some of these solutions that are available to us, they come across a range of approaches, and then there's sub-approaches within that, but I'm going to kind of touch on this lightly tonight, given the time frame. So one that's the most straightforward of how do we create protection in infrastructure is through essentially a vertical seawall that protects us, the water out, and the inland side in of that seawall. The next strategy would be to not focus on keeping the water out from the land's edge, but focused on water tighting our buildings and the structures so water cannot penetrate inboard. Those are kind of two structural solutions. Now we're going to look at kind of two more green infrastructure solutions. The next one is what's called kind of a raised harbor walk or park space, in which the existing land edge is here, the water is outboard of it, and what we do is we create a raised levee and landform to keep the water out, and also, again, to hopefully provide more than just that. We provide public amenity, a place where people can gather, maybe a place where there's a route along the water's edge, so it's a place of transit as well. So this one kind of respects the water's edge. One of the things that we're faced with in kind of modern day, which hasn't been, up till now, hasn't been perceived as permittable, is the idea of constructed ground, where in some instances, we're restricted how much we can do inland, and so the possibility of doing more land filling into the water to help do protection and also create additional green infrastructure into the water. And the last one is kind of a raising our transportation up out of the water and our navigation so that it protects it. So I'm going to just show you quickly kind of what do those solutions look like. So vertical seawall, kind of like Joppa Park, we think of as a pretty straightforward concrete structure. That could also take a more artful form, as you see at the bottom. Again, a protective structure, but using some kind of a Corten steel element, which is more attractive. Protection of buildings, essentially envelopes and windows and doors that have sealants and are designed to protect against floodwaters. Building with potentially deployable doors that also provide additional protection. On the land side, thinking again of these kind of raised solutions that protect. Some can be more hardscape, like you see at the bottom, or they can be more of a green infiltrating nature, and again, contribute to the ecology and the environment on the upper right-hand side. Then the kind of land filling forms where we think about, and you can see these little vignettes on the right-hand side, those can take the place of kind of constructed dunes, constructed barrier, a salt marsh, which is built out into the water's edge, and or a constructed harbor walk. So what you're seeing is there's kind of a toolkit that one can use. And then as we think about the navigational areas that are protected, you may be familiar with kind of tide gates that have been created here in the Netherlands, also a similar one being created outside of Venice, and then deployable structures that protect temporarily against climate change and sea level rise. I think that, the one point I want to make is that what we've learned and what we're learning is that it's not a one size fits all, but that as we look around sites, there's a lot of variability. So you end up incorporating a variety of different solutions to create an overall barrier. And the other thing is that a lot of solutions have been coming about site by site, but what we're learning is that it's important that we achieve regional solutions that protect an entire area. That requires a lot of planning and a lot of coordination, because if it's a site-by-site solution, essentially your weakest link is the place where you have vulnerability. So I'm just going to show you again, now we zoom in a little bit on the South Boston study that we did, and there's a series of different kind of strategies that we assessed and worked with the city on. So there's a strategy A, which is what protects the most, which is right at the water's edge, and the assessment of the cost of kind of that type of a strategy. And that strategy protects some things and then allows other things outboard of it to be more vulnerable. There's a yellow strategy that then is more expensive, but protects essentially everything because it encompasses all along the edge. And so then kind of zooming into this area right adjacent to Fan Pier, just showing you a couple of those and how they could be implemented in terms of, again, there's not one solution, but a variety of options to be considered. Kind of along the existing edge of Fan Pier, the idea of introducing a vertical seawall, or taking a more green infrastructure approach where you capture some of that, what was marina, and create larger open space that can be floodable and can contain some of the water as well, and modifications to the marina, or a solution that protects the entire area where you bring that, again, the barrier around the outside, and you protect everything inboard of the marina and such. So again, kind of just showing you again along Fort Point Channel, similar kind of thing. It creates thinking of kind of this toolkit of solutions and how you tie those toolkit of solutions to create a continual regional strategy. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer to give you a real idea of kind of on the ground what it feels like. This is a study we looked at the Children's Museum, if you know where that is, along Fort Point Channel. That's the building to the right, Fort Point Channel on the left. And this kind of shows you kind of existing grade on the left of the Harbor Walk, which is continuous along the harbor's edge. What is the average kind of monthly tide down here at elevation 4, Harbor Walk at elevation 10, and then the predicted sea level rise, the 9 inches at 12 and 40 inches. And so the city is really looking to get to a point where we're protecting probably 12 inches above the 40-inch barrier. So we looked at a variety of different solutions, one of which is this allowing the Harbor Walk in the front area to flood, tying that permanent kind of what we call passive or permanent solution into the adjacent park, and creating what's a deployable floodgate. So this is permanent, the wall is here always, and when there's concern, this requires somebody to then come out and implement a gate, put a gate in place that then protects this additional area. This next solution, option 2, takes a different tack where it says, okay, the Harbor Walk is going to continue to be floodable, but we're going to introduce an element here that is kind of a wall, but it's also kind of an element that people can take advantage of on most normal days. It can be served as a bleacher where people can hang out adjacent to the Children's Museum and gather and socialize and so forth, and yet provides that additional protection. Again, multiple benefits of infrastructure investment. Or we could take a more holistic approach, put the barrier at the outside. This shows a more green or a gray infrastructure where it's just simply a wall protecting everything inland of including the Harbor Walk. And then a more ambitious approach, which again is this land building where it's kind of moving into the Fort Point Channel, creating living shoreline there, and then having it also as a public amenity as an additional habitat along the Fort Point Channel edge. So we're going to go from kind of this larger planning studies to a couple of projects that we've worked on that take existing sites and improve their resiliency and their environmental benefits. The first site we're going to look at is down along the Neponset River, almost to Quincy, Dorchester being here, JFK Library and so forth up in this area, and right adjacent to the Neponset River. This site here was historically had different uses through time, but is most known for being a significant paper plant in which there was a lot of contamination that occurred on the site. And so DCR became owner of this property, which is Division of Conservation Resources for the state of Massachusetts. They wanted to make it into a public amenity and adjacent to the community. And they also were interested in kind of seeing how we could create a more resilient, naturalized living shoreline along the edge of the Neponset River. So just going back, so this being kind of the living shoreline that we're going to be talking about, I just wanted to do a little primer on living shorelines. Living shorelines are great sources, and we have them all really throughout the Great Marsh here, but they're great sources of storing carbon. They trap sediment. They provide great opportunity for habitat and biodiversity as well as recreation. Living shorelines in the form of marshes and oyster reefs are actually great absorbers of wave energy during normal times and also during kind of storm events. And they're more resilient than gray infrastructure. But our tendency has been through time to more harden our shorelines. In fact, it's anticipated that 33% of our shorelines in the US will be hardened by 2100. So looking at green infrastructure instead, this is the existing edge of that Schaefer paper site. On the uphill side was some Phragmites, some invasive species here, and kind of a degraded, you can see degraded and eroded shoreline. So we were able to come in working with a local environmental consultant, Mike DeRosa from Ipswich, and we were able to regrade, remove the invasives mechanically, replant with Spartina here, and then after a period of about 2 years, get this living shoreline to establish. And then this is the upland side of that park as a recreational resource for the community. Now we're going to move downtown to a more highly developed site. Also, again, highlighting its kind of the opportunity for benefits. This is the East Boston harbor edge, directly across from kind of, you'll probably know more readily, Marriott Long Wharf, the aquarium, and Christopher Columbus Park. It's this is the site in its prior condition. It too had, like many of our waterfronts, just like Newburyport's waterfront, had a lot of industrial uses that resulted in those prior uses once either going away or abandoning the site left degraded environmental contamination. This site happened to be particularly blessed with asbestos contamination. So that the cost of that, as well as real estate values up until the past decade, made development in East Boston not as practical. But given the current, up till now, the current real estate increase in East Boston made this site practical for redevelopment. So this redevelopment was facing both the kind of environmental issues, subgrade, as well as being adjacent to the harbor with sea level rise issues and climate change issues facing it. So one of the things that City of Boston now is looking at is the idea that new development has to plan for sea level rise. In fact, it has to design for what I described as for commercial applications, it has to plan for 40 inches of sea level rise, but plus what they call 12 inches of freeboard, which is in addition to that 40 inches of sea level rise, it's got to plan for additional 12 inches for establishing what is the floor level of commercial structures. That is increased to 24 inches over the 12 inches for residential structures. So when this project was being developed, given the environmental conditions, it was also beneficial to raise up the finished floor elevations of the site as to not to get it down into the contaminants. So there's a parking garage underneath it. So one of the benefits of building along the harbor is there's the commitment to Chapter 91, which requires public access all along the site. So you will notice as I show you some of this, there's some terrific public access improvements that the developer is committed to within this whole site, both along its perimeter as well as in the center of the site. And so I was going to show you some of, this is a view from the harbor's edge looking back with kind of a living shoreline and a built up amphitheater area. And then this is the kind of final product, which was just completed within the past year, all residential, some condos and some apartment buildings. We were able to salvage a lot of the granite block that was used in the seawall of the project to reclaim and reutilize in this kind of stepped amphitheater that steps down to the living shoreline. Now we're going to look back in the other direction, and here you see the amphitheater stepping down into, again, kind of a terraced living shoreline where the water comes up, is able to flood, where we again have Spartina and some kind of transitional coastal edge plantings along here. Now I'm going to focus out in this area, out beyond the edge of the development. One of the fun parts about the development is that the developer wanted to challenge ourselves to make this a really distinct project. And so this project had a decaying seawall out at the edge of the perimeter sticking into the harbor. And instead of taking on the development rights and developing the project the whole way out to closer to the water's edge, we talked about creating a living shoreline. Instead of filling, we actually excavated out this area and created a hole in part of the seawall to encourage the seawater to come in, and for it to, as the public is able to get close, we wanted to highlight for them this, twice a day experience firsthand of the drama of kind of tidal change. And so I'm going to show you a little cartoon of, this is the site, this is the building projection, and then this is the public walkway that goes around. And so this is kind of at low tide, and there's a progression of the water infiltrating from the sides as it gets to mid tide and then progresses up to high tide, so that at high tide, you essentially, when you're on this public walkway, feel like you're in the middle of the harbor. And so this is kind of the resultant condition where the living shoreline in the foreground, which is an environmental amenity, an ecological amenity, and a public amenity. And there's a kind of an interpretive panel that tells you kind of all about what is attempting to be accomplished here. And you've got a beautiful view of Boston Harbor in the background. So again, a view of Clipper Ship Wharf in its prior condition before redevelopment, and then its kind of restored condition afterwards. Now, all public infrastructure and green infrastructure isn't just isolated to the coastal areas, but we're working on a couple projects in Cambridge, and Cambridge is very strong in its belief of looking at complete streets, and complete streets is defined as kind of being more equitable about the cross-section of what occurs between the buildings on roadways. Between here and here isn't just about getting vehicles moving, but it's about pedestrians, bikes, and buses and vehicles equitably, or more equitably. So this street is called Western Avenue. It has a companion street, River Street. Western Avenue goes, as its name implies, goes west towards the Harvard Alston campus from Central Square. On the next parallel street over is River Street. This project is completed, and we're now working on River Street in a similar vein. But what you'll see is on the right-hand side, this project has been driven by an infrastructure replacement project. So while those infrastructure is being replaced, we've been able to move it out into what was the edge of a travel lane and create a widened streetscape on the one side. So that has involved, again, rebuilding of infrastructure below grade, and then the above grade benefit is this. On the far side, you get an enhanced, treeway, tree zone, and public amenity zone along the street edge, sidewalk along the back edge, and then on a more enhanced opposite side of the street where you've widened it more readily to accommodate bus shelters and green infrastructure plantings right along the street edge in association with where you eliminate parking. And so all of this is buffered, and then you get a very highly defined kind of off-road bike zone, cycle track, separate and distinct from the pedestrian circulation. And we place street trees in between that, all over top of kind of a sand-based structural soil, so the trees are able to take advantage of a continuous bed of planting soil underneath. And then the cycle track is pervious asphalt. So what's that look like in the completed condition? This is the completed condition. Again, you get a great healthy row of street trees that's taking advantage of the fact that there's good soil underneath the whole thing, water infiltrating into it, and then periodic plantings that break up the width of the street overall. In addition to that, at certain points in the street, we were able to take advantage of continuous planting beds along the edge and breaking the curb to allow stormwater to come in, stormwater to infiltrate here, sediment get dispersed, and nutrients get dispersed before the overflow heads into the public storm drain. So a couple project in Cambridge there. Now, I'm just going to step back for a second and kind of look at bigger picture. You think these are interesting. I think it's really interesting to see what's being thought of around the globe, just to be really ambitious for a minute. So Copenhagen has experienced some pretty extensive flooding in the recent years, which has woken themselves up to, you know, having to take measures to combat that. So Copenhagen is predicted to get essentially a 50%, up to a 50% increase in rainfall during the winter, in combination with almost a 50% reduction in precipitation in the summer. So they're going to have much greater drought conditions, but much greater precipitation conditions in the winter. And so this is one project of 300 projects in which they're looking at redesigning some of their public open space to help accommodate that. So this is a project called Ivanhaven Park, a classic little park in which they've rebuilt each of these to have substantial infrastructure and water support capacity below grade, where you don't see it, and some places where you do see it. So one of the projects, this particular park here, is being built kind of as a 1 meter down in park that can be a public amenity during most days. But when there's strong storm events, instead of stormwater going to storm drains and being headed out to the river or flooding the local areas, given the capacity of storm drains, instead the stormwater is fed to these particular locations, both here above grade and to these areas below grade. And just this one area is able to accommodate essentially the equivalent of 10 Olympic swimming pools. And then this water is slowly then released into, versus rapidly released into the environment, slowly released. It can also be used for street sweeping and for tree irrigation. Another pretty bold move is in Bangkok, where the city has developed over much densely than it was over time, and given its density and amount of impervious surface, has had a lot of environmental degradation and water runoff and erosion issues. And so they've taken the measure of kind of akin to the Central Park vision for Central Park, which Central Park existed before the city did. In this instance, this is kind of a retroactive Central Park, creating a 12-acre Central Park in the center of Bangkok, of which stormwater is captured along the main boulevard re-envisioned as a greenway, and that stormwater redirected, much like the vision of kind of a tree and its roots coming out from it, to this Central Park. And then that Central Park becomes a place where it's a destination, you know, where there was lack of green space in the city, there is green space, and it's productive green space for enhancing quality of life and contributing to the ecology of the city. And then more locally, looking at Portland, Oregon, I happen to be very fond of this project, in which the site was excavated to where it was filled to try to harken back to its former ecological basis as Tanner Springs in Portland, around which there was development. And this site is both beautiful and functional in that it has environmental benefits and ecological benefits, provides habitat. Stormwater from the adjacent sites is brought here where it can be pre-treated and captured instead of, you know, overtaxing the municipality. And then, you know, who's to say that green infrastructure can't be artful? The reuse of railroad ties as an art form within the site. So a lot of different benefits, and then this site becomes such a destination that it has terrific economic impact to the area around it. Now coming back to where we live and opportunities here, thinking even modestly, I want to go back to, we first, Ellie Baker and I, who's a local woman who works for Horsley Witten Group, we presented this idea to the city. It's hard to believe that it's already 10 years ago. That looked at the amount of large paved areas that we have in Newburyport, you know, any number of them. Here you see highlighted from the Park and Ride, Port Plaza, Anna Jake's Hospital, etc. That there's a lot of paved parking lots and a lot of runoff, a lot of impervious surface, heat islands, and you know, what do they typically look like? They typically look like this. And how do we deal with stormwater? We often look at putting in subsurface highly expensive structured systems below grade to hold that water and so that it doesn't run off. We're talking about, as we look through time and, as the reliance on personal vehicles potentially decreases and we hopefully head towards more public transportation, there are opportunities. I will grant you that this is pretty visionary. Is there opportunities to remove selectively parking areas and provide green infrastructure? Well, you may say that's crazy. You may look then at this slide, which shows a pretty traditional parking lot, given that even though it's tandem spaces, it's probably a corporate parking lot, but you've essentially reduced what could be 100% paving into about a 50% green, 50% hardscape to reduce and capture stormwater on site. Also, within Newburyport, we're challenged by the fact that we've got High Street, which is high, and Merrimack Street, which is low, and we have a lot of wide roadways, be it Kent Street, Broad Street, King Street, State Street, etc., on down to the Federal Street to the south end. And so a lot of the challenges that we face, especially if you ask business owners downtown, is a lot of that water during these storms that we've been talking about with high levels of precipitation and runoff result in flooding downhill from that, all as the water heads from High Street towards the river, and if we think boldly, we think about kind of projects that are, again, harkening to Portland, where we think about public streets and analogize that to what we've just talked about, and the ability to introduce green infrastructure where you can see kind of the curbs along the edge of the roadway allow for stormwater to penetrate, and then some of that stormwater is then captured, filtered, and held before it's released and can be amenities for the landscape as well. And if we think about that along some of our existing streets, it's easy to picture those without much interruption in what exists there now. So what are the benefits of stormwater management? Again, they kind of retain water for a longer time period versus running off. They reduce the amount of erosion. There's opportunity for groundwater recharge. In a lot of our urban areas, we've depleted our groundwater, so that allows us to kind of add back to our groundwater and increase base flows underground to streams. In addition, these kind of solutions can be beautiful. They don't have to just be functional, but they can be beautiful. They serve to capture sediment as runoff, capture organic contaminants, and they kind of, if you look at them against the cost of subsurface infrastructure costs, the costs are less significant. It just requires a commitment to maintenance, which is, is a different mode from which we've been used to thinking. So if we look at opportunities, if you think about Greenleaf Street, along where the CVS is, expansive amounts of asphalt, couldn't there be opportunities to introduce elements like this that allow for stormwater runoff and green infrastructure to take place? Also, again, along Kent Street and the broader streets, again, the idea of, where we've got double-sided parking, some places selectively introducing, replacing parking with some green infrastructure just to reduce the amount of stormwater that's running downhill towards Merrimack Street and the river. So what's that look like in cross-section? Here's our kind of existing conditions where we got two-way travel, parking on both sides. We've got an extra generous roadway width. We still can accommodate, all that, and yet have stormwater treatment inboard of that. So just to end where we're at with a few thoughts, if any of this is compelling to you and you found it interesting, what kind of is going on right now, and who's kind of in the thought leaders in this? The Trust for Public Land, if you look them up on the web, has got an interesting strategy of connect, cool, absorb, and protect. So connect is about focusing on human connection through multimodal connections, bike and ped. Cooling through thinking about investments in our urban forests. Absorbing is thinking about the kind of surfaces that we've got, so we reduce runoff, and protection is as we've discussed, strategies of sea level rise and extreme climate protection. And how are they doing that? If you look on their website, Trust for Public Land, they're doing a lot of GIS planning with a variety of different cities throughout the country, including Boston and what they call the Metro Mayors Conference that includes a lot of the cities that are closer to Boston. And some of their outputs are these kind of layered GIS plans that are very useful on focusing where do we put our capital investments to get the greatest impact. And so this is a layer that shows focused, in red on those with the greatest need based on assessing a variety of those vulnerabilities. And some of those layers include assessing where are the heat islands most extreme, where are the places that we may not often think about where there's structures, whether it be electrical substations or sewage treatment plants or other critical services or hospitals or police stations or fire stations that may be vulnerable to climate change, and protecting those. So all those layer up to give us, assist us in assessing where investments are most needed. Another organization I want to highlight, because I had said earlier on that one of the important things is to think about how we develop solutions that connect all the dots and don't leave gaps in between them, is the Mystic River Watershed Association, which is thinking about climate resiliency on a watershed scale, in which they're trying to get, I think it's the 13 communities that make up that watershed, to think about solutions that don't just stop at the town borders, but cross over them. And so they're a very interesting group to follow in terms of, I think they're trying to set up, be a prototype that can be repeated, throughout the state in terms of setting up a governance across the watershed level. And then in terms of funding, this program is started as a kind of small effort, but the governor and the environmental secretary have started to get behind this, such that cities can become, and I think Newburyport is an MVP city already, they can get funding to have municipal vulnerability plans prepared, and based upon the vulnerabilities identified in those plans, then submit grants to address those issues as related to the priorities. And so this program is starting to ramp up in terms of the funding available to it. But the continued challenge for the state and for all municipalities is kind of the governance and how they both raise the capital for levying fees to pay for this, as well as for the infrastructure, as well as long-term maintenance. So if that's not enough for you all, I hope that was of interest. And if you got any questions, happy to kind of chat more about it.
So anybody who's interested in asking a question, feel free to come off mute at this point and speak your question, or type it in the chat if you prefer.
This is David Chatfield. What are your thoughts, Bob, on a design flood level that Newburyport should consider? If we talked about design flood level being FEMA, base flood elevation plus sea level rise, I mean, what do you think we should be looking at for new development and then as a measure for retrofitting?
I'm not as familiar with calculations as it relates to Newburyport, but I would think that they're not far off of what Boston is thinking about. I do know that FEMA tends to historically look in the rearview mirror, whereas much of the zoning and the changes in the thinking are based upon looking forward. So it's hard for me to project an exact elevation for you, but I would think that a projected horizon that is looking at kind of, again, similar to, if we use Boston as kind of a model in which they've started to come around to some pretty progressive thinking about, 40 inches of sea level rise plus freeboard, I think would be something that, one would want to think about. The other notion is that in terms of how you think about the solutions that are placed, the importance is thinking about solutions that can also be modular, which means when you've built them, that they haven't reached their ultimate, such that you could, in some scenario, be additive to them if the conditions got worse than what is currently anticipated. So that's kind of a lot of the current thinking of how do you create a solution that is that can be in place and maybe isn't built to the ultimate height, but is built to a certain height such that, it could be progressively added to as time goes on.
Thank you.
Bob, I think some of the solutions that you've been involved in Boston are just beautiful. I hope we can leverage some of those as they're considering expanding the waterfront park and different areas of protection around town.
Right, as you see, I think, one of the challenges as the waterfront park expansion is thought about will be that question of like, okay, what does there'll be different levels of investment opportunity. Do we allow the Riverwalk to be flooded, as we look into the future, or do we protect that? If we protect that, that has a different kind of, it has a different look and feel to what the edge of the harbor, the Riverwalk is now versus, what it would be in that future. Or do we look to inboard of that? Do we allow the Riverwalk to be periodically flooded such that the protection occurs kind of inboard where the park is, such that the park is built up? I think one of the good benefits of, the waterfront park and some of the challenges of, again, like all the sites that we talked about on these, industrial waterfronts where there's contamination. The beauty is that it's going to be beneficial to build up because you'll be capping contaminants, but you'll also be building up, which gives you a better view of the water, and you'll be building up, which will create protection. The challenge will be that, the waterfront park, if it's built up, will only protect that area, but you'll have vulnerabilities, to either side of where that protection occurs.
We have a question in the chat from Anita Brewer. She's asking if people are looking into shifting some activities into the water as it rises, like floating housing or floating solar power structures or even agriculture.
That's interesting. I've seen it in a lot of the visionary discussions about kind of what does the future of development look like. I haven't seen any too many in application, so to speak. I have seen some more floating wetlands, but much more on a smaller scale. I think they've actually introduced one into the Charles River recently.
Great idea. Other questions?
Yes, this is Bonnie Sontag. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bonnie.
I hear your warning or idea that we should really have a complete resiliency plan, and your comment right now about Waterfront Park is a good example of that. So you do something on one site and then it could have adverse effects on either side or elsewhere. My question is, though, in the interim, given that we don't seem to have, even unless I don't know about it, any initiatives going toward having a more expansive plan in Newburyport, would you think it would be advisable to consider some land use zoning changes that would incorporate ideas for green infrastructure into projects through special permits or site plan review or something of that nature? Or would that potentially lead to more problems than if we just left it until we had a bigger plan for the whole city?
That's a good question. Doing something is better than doing nothing, I think. And I think, the one thing is that there's this notion of, you really can't impact the ocean. The ocean is going to fill wherever it's going to fill, such that if you did market, I'm not necessarily saying so, if you did Waterfront Park, would it adversely affect, otherwise, because it's not like because you're filling Market Landing Park in and raising it up that you're actually going to affect what the ocean fills, because the ocean's going to fill one way or another. If those elevations are lower around it, it's still going to fill those elevations, not just because you've added land to the ocean in a 1 acre amount. That said, I think, any strategies that can be forward thinking relative to zoning and looking at, changes to development, I think are both wise and proactive. I think, again, I think some of the things that Boston has been looking at are, really smart. I think the more we can introduce green infrastructure both into our site and into our architecture, the better off we're going to be, because it's going to not just a sea level rise, but in just, any number of environmental benefits. I'm just kind of been amazed that Boston hasn't gone along with other cities and required green roofs on any of its new construction or retrofitted construction, because I think that's an easy win in a lot of regards.
Thank you.
Other questions for Bob?
The other thing I would add is some of these, I think one of the challenges that that you'll start to see, that there's an organization that you may or may not know of. So the Barr Foundation has funded a lot of these studies with the city of Boston. And there's another organization called the Green Ribbon Commission in Boston, all of which are kind of looking at, next steps. There's been a lot of kind of planning, I think, fatigue. You'll see a lot of these climate ready projects that have been planned for, but people are saying, okay, when are we going to get to implementation? So I think there's getting to be a lot more focus both at the governor's level and at other agency levels to try to figure out, okay, what does this look like in terms of how do we both, it's going to require additional investment. So are those investments on a regional scale, and how do we, so to speak, levy those folks that are right at the water versus those folks that are inboard of the water? Because those that are at the water's edge, so to speak, are more prone to it, but they're, in effect, if they invest, they are protecting people inboard. So I think there's the thinking about, an equal levy across that. But that's still there's a lot of calculations going on and a lot of people thinking based upon other precedents around the world. And there's also the idea of a storm, we have sewer and water taxes that we pay. I think there's a lot of thinking about stormwater taxes, and those taxes are often have some basis on a factor of how pervious or impervious your site is. So if your site is highly impervious, your rate of taxing is higher. If your site accommodates stormwater much more readily, your tax rate is much lower. So it kind of encourages you to be more environmentally friendly, so to speak.
Just to repeat a couple of questions that we answered in the chat. Bob's presentation is being recorded and it's being shown tonight, and will be repeated on some of the local cable TV channels. It's also will end up on the Storm Surge YouTube channel, and there's a link to that archive on the Storm Surge webpage. So you'll be able to find it and share it if you'd like to.
Bob, have you had a chance to look at the Newburyport Climate Resiliency Plan? It's only recently been released, but I wondered if you'd had a look at that.
I have not.
Reaction?
I have not. I should probably take a shot at that, but I haven't looked at it yet. No.
I don't think it's widely circulated. It is on the city website, and basically does reflect, the MVP, because as you said, Newburyport is MVP certified and did produce an MVP plan, and a lot of the recommendations in the resiliency plan are similar to the MVP plan, as you would expect. So yeah, it would be good if you could take a look, and feedback would be welcomed, I think.
I'll try to do that. It's rather interesting because Boston right now has released its first RFP for actually an implementation project in East Boston, right adjacent to the project that I just showed you. So one of the challenges has been that there's a couple development projects, Clippership Wharf, which in and of itself is resilient, and then there's another project adjacent to it that has been built essentially on either side. And what else would you expect? But the areas that are vulnerable are the kind of roadways that are adjacent to it that are left down to grade. And so there's a RFP out now to study, what are the resiliency measures that could bring those areas, and ideally in a passive solution, one that is fixed and not deployable that could address, could achieve the 2040, 40 inches of sea level rise.
Bob, it looks like Susan has a question. Susan, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, actually, it's Ed Hand. Susan's my wife.
Got it.
We were well familiar with Newburyport since I have a brother-in-law who lives there, and my father-in-law owned Lowell's Boat Shop for quite a while and turned it into a working museum. But my question is, we live in Rockport, and we're about to enter a contract, I think, with MAPC to do a review of our zoning. And I'm wondering about if there are any good examples of seaside communities who've done a good job from a zoning standpoint to address an earlier question about zoning that addresses some of these issues.
I will admit that zoning is not an area of my expertise. So though MAPC is a good outfit to, they've got a breadth of experience. They're probably involved in the Trust for Public Land efforts that I was talking about.
Okay.
So I think that they would probably be, have a wealth of resources to draw from. Rick, you don't have any thoughts on that one, do you?
I don't, but I do have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you have any good examples of standards or guidelines for communities as they're redoing their streets and so forth? Your ideas looking at some of the cross streets going down from High to Merrimack or to Water are great, but I think that we need a little bit more help in learning how to think in a more forward-looking fashion. So I was just wondering whether there are other communities you know of that have kind of a cookbook of how to, when you're looking at redoing a street or repaving a street or doing some street tree work or something like that, what types of ways you might look at introducing rain gardens or other types of green infrastructure, because that really is something that we have a wealth of wide streets, and we don't really need all that width. So we could really recapture some of that for green infrastructure.
I'm trying. Boston has the Complete Streets Manual, which is a pretty good manual, but I don't know that it's necessarily tailored to what you're asking. I'd have to look. I also think they have a green infrastructure guidelines, and I haven't really looked deeply into it, but I'd have to look and see whether it has that. Cambridge is often at the forefront of many of these things. So I'd be happy to talk to you about it further. But those are the two kind of resources that I often go to relative to, what the latest thinking is on if you can call it prototypes that
Right.
or models.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour. Are there any other questions at this point? Sheila, do you want to take over?
Yes, I was just trying to, but I was muted.
Oh,
I've taken care of that. So Bob, on behalf of Storm Surge, Newburyport, Livable Streets, and all of us watching live, I want to thank you for such an illuminating and interesting presentation. It really is inspiring to see examples of what can be done for useful purposes, but also for beauty. You've given us lots of food for thought for what we can do here in Newburyport. I hope our audience members will join us for a wonderful follow-up program on planning for resilience on the third Thursday in December. Steve Whitman and Liz Kelly of Resilience Planning and Design will talk about what resilience looks like on the ground and how it can be used to address food security, climate change, natural resource protection, and equity-related issues. So I think it's a wonderful follow-up to what Bob has done tonight. I want to thank you all for coming, and good night, and I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving.